Trump wants Lake America as Canada confrontation spirals. Trump turns on Ontario as tariff war erupts across U.S.-Canada border. Donald Trump has opened an extraordinary new front in his confrontation with Canada, saying the United States is giving serious consideration to changing the name of Lake Ontario to Lake America. What might otherwise sound like political theater has landed in the middle of a rapidly intensifying trade fight between two countries whose economies, industries, and border communities have been intertwined for generations. The remark came as the argument moved far beyond negotiating room pressure. Canada has announced new retaliatory tariffs after the United States imposed 50% tariffs on $27.6 billion of Canadian goods, turning an increasingly hostile relationship into a genuine economic confrontation, with consequences on both sides of the border. Trump takes the fight to Lake Ontario. Trump linked his proposed name change directly to deteriorating relations with Ontario, saying the United States did not expect to be doing much business with the province for much longer. It was not presented as an isolated joke. It arrived alongside a much broader campaign of economic and political pressure on Canada. The symbolism is hard to miss. Lake Ontario physically joins the two countries Trump is now fighting over trade. New York sits along its southern and eastern shores, while the Canadian province of Ontario dominates much of the northern and western side, including Toronto. Trump has already demonstrated that he is willing to use geographical renaming as an expression of his America First politics. Shortly after returning to office in 2025, he ordered the U.S. government to adopt Gulf of America for the area historically called the Gulf of Mexico in federal usage. Lake Ontario, however, presents an even clearer international complication. It is a boundary water shared by Canada and the United States, not an exclusively American geographical feature. Canada is now fighting back. The timing makes Trump's intervention substantially more significant than another argument over names. Canada announced on Tuesday that it would match new American tariffs dollar for dollar and rate for rate after Washington imposed a 50% tariff on $27.6 billion of Canadian products from August 22. Ottawa said its countermeasures would take effect on September 8. Canadian tariffs of 15%, 25%, and 50% will hit American products across sectors including steel, dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp and paper, and electronics. That means the dispute has reached the stage where governments are deliberately imposing additional costs on one another's exports. Canada says it had negotiated in good faith, but suspended negotiations after Washington demanded terms Ottawa regarded as contrary to Canadian interests. The Canadian government has framed its retaliation as defending workers, businesses, strategic industries, and national sovereignty, rather than simply trying to punish the United States. The result is a profound deterioration in one of America's most economically important bilateral relationships. What would Lake America actually mean? Trump could potentially order American federal agencies to use a different geographical designation within the U.S. government, just as his administration did with the Gulf of America. That would not give Washington the power to force Canada to abandon the name Lake Ontario. The difference matters because the lake forms part of an international system governed through more than a century of U.S.-Canadian cooperation. The International Joint Commission exists under the 1909 Boundary Waters Treaty specifically to help the two countries manage and resolve disputes concerning shared waters. Lake Ontario's water levels and outflows are overseen through a binational structure involving Canadian and American representation. Renaming it for American federal purposes would therefore be substantially easier than somehow creating a universally recognized international name. Canada could simply continue calling it Lake Ontario. International organizations, foreign governments, mapping companies, and other institutions would face their own decisions over terminology. The practical effect could therefore resemble the argument produced by Trump's Gulf of America decision. American government documents and maps could adopt one designation while other countries continued using another, the Gulf of America precedent. When Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, he ordered the federal government to rename the U.S. portion of the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America. The administration described the move as an expression of American greatness and argued that the body of water was critical to U.S. energy, fishing, tourism, and maritime industries. Trump subsequently proclaimed February 9, 2025, as Gulf of America Day. Lake Ontario, therefore, fits an established pattern in Trump's political language. Geography becomes part of a broader message about sovereignty, national power, and the assertion of American interests. But the political circumstances surrounding Lake Ontario are considerably more combustible. The suggestion has emerged not at the beginning of an administration looking for symbolic victories, but during an accelerating dispute with a neighboring country that shares the lake. A trade fight is becoming a sovereignty fight. The deeper significance of Lake America is therefore not whether signs around Toronto are about to change. They are not. It is that the vocabulary surrounding the US-Canada dispute is moving away from a conventional disagreement about tariffs and towards a confrontation over sovereignty, leverage, and national identity. Trade disputes between Washington and Ottawa are hardly unprecedented. The two economies have fought repeatedly over lumber, dairy, agriculture, metals, and market access, while remaining close allies. The current confrontation is becoming harder to contain because the language increasingly reaches beyond those individual sectors. Ottawa says accepting the latest U.S. terms would have compromised Canadian interests. Trump is publicly suggesting that a Great Lake bearing the name of Canada's largest province could instead carry America's name. Neither message sounds like preparation for a routine technical compromise. Why Ontario matters so much? Ontario is not a peripheral participant in the Canadian economy. It is Canada's most populous province, and one of the central components of the extraordinarily integrated North American manufacturing system. Automotive production illustrates the problem particularly well. Components can cross the US-Canada border multiple times before a finished vehicle reaches a buyer, meaning tariffs imposed against one side can ripple through factories, suppliers, and consumers on the other. A prolonged confrontation therefore risks creating costs that cannot be neatly confined to Canada. American importers may pay tariffs. Manufacturers may confront more expensive components. Canadian exporters may lose customers. Governments can retaliate again. The economic relationship that normally makes escalation unattractive is itself becoming part of the weaponry. The Lake America remark may be more than a joke. Trump has frequently used provocative public statements to establish negotiating pressure before deciding whether to turn them into formal policy. That makes it important not to overstate what has happened. Lake Ontario has not formally been renamed Lake America. Trump has said the idea is receiving serious consideration, but dismissing the remark entirely would also miss what is happening around it. Trump's Gulf of America proposal once sounded unlikely to become official U.S. policy. He subsequently signed an executive order directing the federal government to implement it. His willingness to use presidential authority over American geographical terminology has therefore already been demonstrated. The real question is whether Lake Ontario becomes another symbolic assertion of that approach, or remains rhetorical ammunition in the fight with Canada. Canada has an obvious answer. Even if Trump ultimately orders American federal agencies to use Lake America, Canada does not have to follow. That could leave one of the world's most famous international waterways carrying competing names depending on which side of the border produced the map. And that may capture the state of the relationship better than Trump intended. For generations, the Great Lakes have been symbols of how deeply the United States and Canada are physically and economically connected. The two countries cannot move the border, separate their supply chains overnight, or give one country exclusive possession of a lake they literally share. Yet Washington and Ottawa are increasingly behaving as though economic interdependence is something to exploit rather than protect. Canada's September 8 counter-tariffs now create the next major deadline. Businesses will be watching for exemptions, further escalation, and any sign that negotiations can restart before the dispute becomes still more expensive. Trump's proposed Lake America may never progress beyond a social media declaration. But its appearance at this particular moment matters. A fight that began with tariffs is increasingly being expressed through the language of national defiance. And even the shared geography between America and Canada is now being pulled into the confrontation.